good evening, and thank you everybody for joining us here at Holborn Assets University Home Fee Status Funding webinar. So today we have on the webinar, backed by popular demand, I must say, Kate Raison, Director of UK Study Options, and also Alex Herbert, Managing Partner with myself over at Holborn Assets. So over to you, Kate, and I'm sure you'll solve lots of problems and questions. We will have a Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Linda. Hi, yes, I'm Kate Raison. I'm Director of UK Study Options. We offer independent university and careers advice to students all over the world who are looking to study at university in the UK. And we know a lot about fee status, so that's what I'm going to cover in this session today. So this is an issue that particularly affects the expat student. So typically when we say expat, we're talking about British and Irish passport holders, maybe some other people, and I'll cover that further on. But these students living abroad often get classified as overseas fee payers, which is obviously a big problem because it means you have to pay more for your university tuition. So we're going to look at why this is a problem and if there is a solution to the problem. But I think it is a good place to start to look at some fee status myths that we very often hear from expat communities. So just to set the record straight, the following statements are not true. So let's have a look. A British passport gets you home fees. This is not technically correct. There are other criteria you need to meet in order to be eligible for home fees. So a British passport alone doesn't get you home fees. You actually might not have a British passport. You might have an Irish passport. You might have a European passport with something like settled status in the UK. There are other immigration criteria that can fit into who gets home fees. So actually, your passport alone doesn't tell us much about whether you're eligible for home fees. We need to know more about you to answer that question. You have to live in the UK for 3 years to get home fees. This is a really common myth that we very much enjoy busting because it means good news if you don't live in the UK. If you live in the UK all your life and you're British, yes, you will get home fees. That's a given. But it's not the case that if you don't live in the UK, you won't get home fees. It's very possible to live outside the UK and still get home fees. That's why I'm here, to give you that good news. It's slightly different from living in the UK, and we're going to cover that in more detail later on so you really understand what the requirement is. You can change to home fees if you become eligible during your degree. Actually, that's not the case, unfortunately. So if you get an overseas offer at university and you accept that offer and then you start your degree, it's not possible to change onto home fees after that point. Even if you think that you have met the eligibility criteria in maybe year 2, year 3, you have to stick with overseas fees until the end of your degree. So when you get those offers, check the fee status, make sure you're happy before you accept, because you won't be able to change it. Our friends got home fees. We're in a similar situation to them, so we'll get home fees as well. This is probably more of an assumption than a myth, and it's quite a fair assumption because in expat communities around the world, people have pretty comparable lives, pretty similar setups. But actually, what goes into deciding whether you get home fees is lots of detail about your life. They will look at things like your employment, your assets, your residence history, your travel pattern, your immigration status. All of these details make up that decision about fees. So you can imagine then that one family's fee status is very different to another family's fee status. So if you know a colleague or another parent in your school who got home fees and you think we'll be okay too, it's not a fair assumption. Do your homework to make sure that you are informed about your chances of getting home fees, because they will not be the same as somebody else's. We don't have to worry about fee status until the UCAS application. Well, actually, by then, it might be too late to think about fee status because fee status assessments are looking at 3 years of your life, particularly the last 3 years of school. So by the UCAS application, you're already 2 years into that time, and you may have let your eligibility for home fees lapse. You may have lost it without realizing. and it's too late. You can't go back in time and get your eligibility back. So probably my biggest takeaway from this webinar to you is think about fee status as early as possible, years in advance of university, and that will give you a significant advantage in achieving home status. So I've told you now, I've set the record straight. You know that these are all myths. Let me know if you hear of any others circulating in your network, and I will clarify those later on. But let me tell you now about the fee status system that we have in the UK, how it works, and why it affects expat students so negatively. Well, universities in the UK distinguish between home fee payers and overseas fee payers. And the reason they do this is because for every home student, universities receive funding from the government, and it subsidises that home student place. And it allows the university to fix a flat fee for the home student. So it's a nice, easy system on the home side. However, universities don't receive any funding from the government for overseas students. So they pass the full cost of that degree on to the overseas student. And that's why there is a big difference in terms of what home versus overseas students are paying for the same degree. And we're going to look at an example on the next slide. So universities need to decide who gets home fees and who gets overseas fees. And they do this by doing a fee status assessment on every single student that applies to them. And it's really an internal administrative process. You may or may not know that they are doing a fee status assessment. They may communicate that with you. They may ask you for information to help them make their decision. They may not, but they are certainly doing a fee status assessment because it's the university's legal requirement to make the decision correctly about what fees to give each student. So it is unavoidable. You will have to have a fee status assessment when you apply to university. So the way they are making the decision about who gets home fees is by using a set of rules and regulations that are given to them by the government. But these rules are problematic. They are very complex. The English rules alone are about 80 pages long. They are very generic, and actually they don't go far enough to show the universities how every single student should be categorized for fees. So it's a very complex legislation it's actually the universities really struggle to use it and decide how every single student should be classified for fees. The other complexity in the system is that there are different fee status rules in each of the 4 UK nations. So England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, they all have different fee status legislation. And if anybody is advising you on fee status, they should be trained in all 4 sets. You need a lot of training to understand fee status rules. So it's actually possible that a student could apply to some universities in England, some universities in Scotland, and in English universities, they might be a home fee payer. But in Scottish universities, they might be an overseas fee payer. And the reason that is because they're actually subject to 2 different sets of fee status rules. And although there's a lot of overlap between the different sets of rules, there are nuances and differences between them that might impact somebody's fee status and make it different in different parts of the country. So the rules and regulations were written a long time ago, over 30 years ago now. They have had various updates and tweaks and changes here and there, but they're effectively the same rules that they've always been, and they're pretty outdated. When they were originally designed, they encompassed all sorts of different students and how they should be classified for fees. So they cover domestic students, international students, people who have naturalized to become British, people who have long residency in the UK, asylum seekers, refugees, any student who applies to a UK university, effectively the rules should say how they should be classified for fees, whether that's home or overseas. However, expat students were not a consideration when the rules were written, and they're still not a consideration. So there's this whole big student group of expat students, as we call them, who are not very well served by the existing rules and regulations. And this results in these students kind of sitting on the borderline between what is a home fee payer and what is an overseas fee payer. And that's why you get lots of instances where some expat students get home fees and others get overseas fees. It seems a bit random. And that's because the rules are not really clearly explaining to the universities how these students should be classified. So we have these rules and regulations. All the universities are using the same rules and regulations in their respective parts of the country, but they are problematic. So what the government does is they allow the universities to use their discretion and their autonomy to make the final judgment call on every student's fee status. So the universities, they are legally obliged to make that as accurate and fair as possible, but they do have that power to make the final decision themselves. So where you have over 250 universities in the UK, all using their discretion and their autonomy to make what is quite a difficult decision, then you get inconsistency. And I'm sure this is something you have heard of in your community, in your school. You have heard of a student applying to 5 universities through UCAS and perhaps getting 2 home offers and 3 overseas offers. And that is because each university is making that fee status decision in isolation of each other. They are not sharing information between universities. They're not communicating. There is no consensus between the 5 universities about that student's fee status. They're making that decision with their own discretion, and they are coming up with different outcomes about what that student's fee status is. So that's how one student can apply to the same course at 5 unis and get different offers for home and overseas fees. Very, very common scenario. Some universities and courses are stricter on fee status than others. So typically the most highly ranked universities in the UK tend to be strict, and courses that are very competitive, such as medicine, dentistry, veterinary, law, engineering, they also tend to be strict. So what I mean by that is, with these universities and these courses, those borderline cases, those expat students are more likely to be given overseas fees in these instances. So where you apply to study and what you want to study impacts your individual chances of getting home fees or not. And that makes up your unique fee status. Overseas students pay between £36,000 and £360,000 more for their degree on top of home fees than their home counterparts. So really quite a lot more than you would pay if you're a home fee payer. And that range is really wide, 36 to 360. So I'll just explain why that is. This is because universities set their own overseas fees. There is no flat rate like there is for the home fee payer. So universities at the top of the ranking, they charge higher fees because they can justify they have a better quality education, they have better facilities that need maintaining, they have more experienced academics that have higher salaries. They are effectively saying at our university, that degree costs more to run, so we have to charge the overseas student higher fees. So those fees from university to university vary very widely. So to get accurate information on what you would pay if you were perceived as an overseas fee payer, you have to choose a course, go to the university website and have a look at the fees on the course page. That's the only way to get that information. But it could be anywhere within that range that I've got on the slide. Overseas students have no access to student finance. So again, if you're perceived as an overseas fee payer, you will not be able to apply for a student loan. Or you could give it a go, but it's extremely unlikely that you'll succeed. The student loans company in the UK is a separate application that students have to do in order to get that tuition fee and maintenance loan. And with that separate application, there is another eligibility check. So a lot of our expat families, even if they are getting home fees at a UK university, later go to apply to the loan and they're not getting the funding. They are being declined for the funding as ineligible. So these are these two hoops that students need to jump: the university tuition fees, and later, if they want to, the student loan. Something to think about. And then the final point on the slide is, not only does your fee status impact what tuition fees you pay and what funding you have available as a student, but it can also impact how competitive the admissions is in general. And that's because if you are classified as an overseas fee payer, you may then be treated as an overseas student and have slightly different admissions process applied to you when you apply. And we're going to look at an example on the next slide. Okay, so this is looking at home fees versus overseas fees. And we're looking at medicine because that's a really popular choice for the students that we support. And we are looking at an English university. So we have to specify where in the country the university is, because on the last slide, if you remember me saying, the fees change in each of the 4 UK nations. So we're just looking at English universities here. So if you are a home fee payer, hopefully you can see my cursor. I'm just gonna kind of wave at this box here. We're looking at this box. Home fee payers, they will pay tuition fees of £9,250 per year of study. That's that flat rate that the home student pays. And that's for medicine, or it's actually, in fact, for any course, because it's the same for every course at every English university. So you might be studying medicine or engineering or business or law, whatever it is, that you pay that rate. Medicine in the UK is a 5-year course, but most degrees are around 3 years or 4 years, depending on the course. But just remember to check the duration of the course when you are doing your budgeting for higher education. If you are a home fee payer, you can apply for a student loan, and I'd recommend that you do. If you believe that you are eligible for home fees, then in theory, you should be eligible for the student loan as well. But that is not a guarantee that they will think the same. So you can, by all means, apply for the student loan, but just manage your expectations that you may not succeed, because this is a trend within the expat students that we are really seeing increasing of them not succeeding in getting the student loan. Ask me more about that in the Q&A if you want to know. In terms of admission, medicine is the most competitive course to apply to in the UK, and it's become increasingly competitive lately in the wake of the pandemic. We've seen 30% more applications to medical degrees in the UK because something like a pandemic inspires, a generation of school leavers to go into health professions and things like that. So it is at an all-time high for competition for medicine in the UK. By comparison, if you are perceived as an overseas fee payer, this is regardless of your passport, then you will pay tuition fees of up to £64,000 per year. So it's important for me to explain that up to. As I mentioned on the previous slide, universities set their own overseas fees, so they can decide what to charge. And there is no flat rate. There's no kind of consensus on what to charge overseas students. So £64,000 is the most expensive medical degree that you can do in the UK, and that's at Cambridge. But there are medical degrees that are not as high as 64,000. You can find degrees that are medical degrees that are 28,000 or 35,000 or 42,000. There are all different levels. And again, the best way to get that information is to look at the university websites. But 64,000 is the highest. And that's what we've put on the slide just as a kind of benchmark. Actually, if you are looking at Cambridge for medicine, it's a 6-year course, not 5-year. So you have another year. And they also have something called college fees at Cambridge, which are just for overseas students. And they are £10,000 per year on top of tuition. So just to explain, college fees, that is not your accommodation. That is additional pastoral and administrative support that they only give to overseas fee payers. So actually, it would be more like £74,000. And that is just to study at the university. So you have other costs to come. So very, very, very high, as I can imagine. If you are an overseas fee payer, again, regardless of your passport or whether you've paid tax in the UK or whether you live there, you won't get a student loan. It's extremely unlikely. So not only are you paying those much higher tuition fees, but you don't have any financial support through the student loan system to help you pay those. And then the final thing in that box is about your admissions chances. And this is really critical for medicine in particular. If you are an overseas fee payer, i.e. not eligible for the public funding, then you'll be treated as an overseas student. And in the UK, medical degrees are capped at the number of overseas students that are allowed onto the programme, because we don't want to train up the world's doctors. The medical degrees we have in the UK must serve the domestic need for doctors, and they must go into the NHS. So there is a legal government cap of 7% on overseas students on all medical courses in the UK. So that might be as few as 2 places or 3 places. So if you've got to fight for one of those places, then it will be expected that you have higher entry requirements, you're scoring more highly in your IB or your A-levels or any other curriculum. You may perform more highly in your interview, and you may need to have a higher admissions test, like a BMAT or a UCAT, in order to get in. So just by virtue of what fees you are given, it suddenly impacts your entire chances of getting an offer, getting into medical school. So fee status impacts the whole admissions process, not just the money part of education. There are some other costs to think about. I've just put those at the bottom of the slide. So thinking about accommodation, food, transport, study materials, things like that. Bit of a range here because it really does depend on student lifestyle and also where in the country you live, obviously. But they're an estimate of around £12,000 to £18,000 per year of study on top of the other costs that we've looked at. And also don't forget about inflation. It's high, right, at the moment. And if you are thinking ahead and your child is going to university in, 3 years' time, 5 years' time, inflation is going to add up on top of those years, and those fees are going to be much, much higher. So you also have to kind of budget for that as well. So this is really the worst case scenario. Medicine is by far the most expensive course in the UK. Other degrees are not as expensive, but I did want you to see the worst case scenario so that you are fully informed of what lies ahead. Other degrees, a lot cheaper, as I say. On average, overseas fees for other degrees are between 2 and 4 times the home rate. So we're still talking about a very, very large amount of money that if you can avoid paying, you certainly want to. So what makes you eligible for home fees? Well, I should explain at the beginning that there are a number of categories within the rules, and students need to fit into one category only to be eligible for home fees. In the English rules, there are 27 categories. So this is another reason why you need lots of training on fee status rules, because you need to know all of those categories. We can't talk about all those categories here because that will take a very long time. But I will put on screen the category that is most relevant to the expat families that we support. But if you don't fit into this category, it doesn't mean that you're not eligible for home fees. It just means you might be eligible under another category of the rules. So the key is to do your homework or inquire with us. We can quickly identify what category of the rules matches your circumstances. But this is the most common. The words in turquoise, I'm going to explain in more detail on the next slide. So don't worry if it doesn't make sense just yet. We will drill down into what exactly this means. So this is for the student. They must be settled in the UK when they start university. I'll explain what that means. The student must be ordinarily resident in the UK for 3 years prior to the start of university. Note that they are not saying you must live in the UK. You must be ordinarily resident. So we'll look at what that means in a mo. Or if you are not ordinarily resident in the UK, then perhaps you are temporarily absent from the UK for employment purposes. And in practical terms, we're thinking about parents' employment, not students' employment. So this is where the criteria slightly refers to the parent rather than the student. So before we have a look at the terms on the next slide, I just want to share this quote with you. This is a quote from an organisation called UKISA. They train us on how to apply fee status rules. They also train the university staff who are making fee status decisions. So they really are the people to trust. They are very respected in the fee status world. And they say, you, meaning the student, might have to persuade an institution that you meet this requirement. And this is a really key quote, in my opinion, because this is very much the experience that our families have and that we have had. The expectation is that if it's not clear what your fee status is, and if you are an expat, a borderline case, then it won't be clear. The expectation is that you will persuade the institution that you meet the eligibility criteria. Fee status is not a checklist. It is not an easy thing. It is a complex assessment. It is easy for somebody to interpret you as an overseas fee payer. And if you don't want that to happen, then the responsibility lies with you to persuade them otherwise. So you have the burden of proof, and we're going to talk a bit more about that further on. But bear that in mind as we carry on through the slides. So we're going to look at those terms that were in the eligibility criteria. And the first one was here, settled. So the criteria was you need to be settled in the UK before you start university. So what does that mean? Well, they give us a bit of jargon here, both ordinarily resident and having no restriction on the length of your stay in the UK. What does that mean? I'll translate it for you. Effectively, it is saying that you have an immigration status for the UK that allows you to come and go, to live, to work. You are not restricted by time in any way, like a visa. And therefore, you're settled. So that might be a British citizen. It might be an Irish citizen. It might be another European passport holder who has settled or pre-settled status in the UK. It might be somebody with indefinite leave to remain or right of permanent abode in the UK. So it's really settled is an umbrella term for lots of different immigration statuses in the UK. And all of our families meet this requirement. It's pretty much a given. So we don't really concern ourselves with this criteria because everybody meets it. So let's look at the second one. That's the tricky one. And it's this one, ordinary residence. So the criteria was you must be ordinarily resident in the UK for 3 years prior to the start of university. So we are given a definition of what ordinary residence means, and it is a regular habitual mode of life in a particular place. Pretty vague, pretty ambiguous. So you can see then how one university's idea of what is a regular habitual mode of life could be very different from another university's idea of what is a regular habitual mode of life. And that's another reason why we get inconsistency from one university to another about whether a student meets this requirement of ordinary residence. But in one way, it's a positive because it's so open to interpretation and it is so subjective. It opens up the possibility that somebody can live outside the UK, and as long as they are maintaining a regular and habitual life back in the UK, they can show that they are maintaining an ordinary residence. And that is a legitimate interpretation of the rules. If they wanted it to be as strict as living in the UK, they could easily update the wording. But they are keeping it open for this ambiguous phrasing of ordinary residence because lots of people living abroad are still eligible for home fees. So this is where we do most of our work with the families we support, building this ordinary residence over a number of years, making sure they don't lose it unwittingly, and therefore making sure that they end up paying home fees. If you have not been maintaining a regular habitual mode of life back in the UK, then perhaps you can argue that you are temporarily absent. So your lives where you live outside the UK are considered an absence. And you need to show that it's merely temporary. It's not a permanent absence from the UK. And this is pretty tricky because we're not given any definition of temporary. So it is left wide open to interpretation. Some universities are perfectly happy with 10, 20 years being a temporary absence and awarding home fees on that basis. Other universities might put a hard deadline on that. So, for example, St Andrews in Scotland, they say that after 5 years, you are no longer temporary. You are now permanently absent from the UK. So whether you have a temporary absence argument for home fees is really dependent on what universities you're applying to, how long you've lived outside the UK, and what the reason for living outside the UK is. Ideally, the reason you live outside the UK should be for temporary employment. So have a think about whether you can show that with some evidence. There's just one more term on here. This wasn't one of the criteria on the previous slide, but it might be relevant for some people. This is called the main purpose test, and it's an additional part of the fee status assessment that is applied in some cases. So, for example, if you live outside the UK, but you send your child to boarding school in the UK, then the universities may apply this test when they are fee assessing you. And it says, if the main purpose for that student living in the UK is for school and otherwise they have no life there, then they're not necessarily ordinarily resident. So basically, if the only reason the student is in the UK is for schooling, which boarding school tends to imply because the rest of the family live elsewhere, then that is not a route to home fees. That is, in our experience, it complicates somebody's home fee case. So if boarding school is something you're thinking about, definitely get advice on that to see how it might impact your fee status chances. So tips on remaining eligible for home fees. The first one, I have underlined it and I've made it bold because this is my biggest takeaway, and it's to think about it as early as possible. Fee status is assessed over that 3 years. Make sure you get ahead of that 3 years if you can. I'm sure this is very much in line with what you're doing in other aspects of your financial life, thinking long-term, thinking well ahead, making smart, sound decisions with lots of information. Fee status is no different from that. So the earlier you think about it, the advantage to you, for sure. Your case is unique, believe it or not. It might seem like other people have a similar situation to you. Maybe you saw them get home fees and you think we'll get home fees. But that's not a safe assumption. As I mentioned earlier, lots of details of your life make up your fee status. So your employment, your property, other assets, your accounts, travel history, residential history, immigration status, what universities you're looking at, what courses you're looking at. This all make up how likely you are to get home fees. So one case is very different to another. And in our opinion, you need personal advice on your case. You need to maintain ordinary residence for 3 years prior to the start of university. So think about when your child is going to start university and work back 3 years. That's really the key period for making sure you stay eligible over that time. What does this look like in practical terms? Well, it may mean having some sort of UK home. And I'm being deliberately vague when I say some sort of home. Families have lots of different homes in the UK. They might have a property themselves. They may rent a property. They may have a relative's property that they regularly connect with. They may have another type of property, but essentially it must be an address that you have a legitimate connection with and that you treat as a sort of home, a base when you are in the UK. So we work very much with families on what that looks like, and then how they can kind of prove it and build evidence around it. But that is really key to having this ordinary residence, a residence in the UK. You need to make regular trips back to that home, back to the country. Every year, really, there needs to be a consistent pattern because ordinary residence is a regular and habitual mode of life. So significant physical presence in the UK is really key to that. And you need to keep your absence, so your life away from the UK, as temporary as possible if you can. You may not be in control of that, But think about things like your employment contract, your property status, your immigration status. What does it say about your absence? Does it say that you're temporary? Does it say that you're more permanently absent? So reflect on that. And if you have any control over that, you might make certain decisions to keep your absence temporary in order to be eligible for home fees later on. You need to build a case. Remember that quote from Ukiza, you need to persuade them that you meet the eligibility criteria. And that means having a case behind you, doing some homework, gathering evidence, and really convincing them that you are legitimately eligible for home fees. It takes work. In our experience, we've been doing this for over 10 years now. And every year we have to work harder and harder to build these cases. To prove it to these universities. If you do get an overseas offer, it's not the end. You can appeal that decision, and you should appeal. It is your right to do so. You may only get one chance to appeal. So make it count, build your case before you hit the appeal button, and make sure that you get it right first time. Okay. So how can we help? If you are thinking this is going to be me and I might have some trouble here, then there is help available with us. And we offer personalized, in-depth fee status advice. And it's ultimately going to increase your chances of getting home fees. We don't guarantee we can get anyone home fees. There are some people who are not succeeding, even if they use our advice. And we're really clear about that. However, we have a really high success rate. So 98% of our families achieve home status. They are all expats living abroad. So they probably have similar profiles to you, but nuances and differences in their case. This is going to save you thousands of pounds, if not tens of thousands of pounds, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds, if you have budding medics in your family, or if you have multiple children who are all looking to go to university in the UK. We are talking about really life-changing amounts of money. And another point, this might seem pretty trivial after we, talk about thousands of pounds, but our advice can really help speed up offers from the university, because what often happens if there are fee status queries on a student's application is it delays the application and slows it down. And if you have kids that are, applying to university or have applied to university in the past, you will know that they have worked so hard in school and so hard on their application. And it is a nail-biting wait to get that offer in from the university of their dreams. And it's just such a shame when those offers are delayed because of an administrative process like fee status. So what we can help is really help the family articulate their fee status case clearly to the university, so the university can make a very quick decision, and that releases that application through to go through to the offer stage. So our families really appreciate that part of our service. We can give you a lot of peace of mind, reduce a lot of stress around a really stressful application time. So if you're interested in that, come and talk to us. We are charging £1,190. That's just a one-off flat rate. And we stay with you up until university admissions and beyond. So you might get us for a few years if you are thinking about this nice and early. We just have a small surcharge of £100 if you are applying to medicine, dentistry or veterinary, because there is a lot more work to do for these courses. Okay, but if you're keen to get some advice on your fee status case, I really recommend that you fill in our form online. We do ask you a lot of questions because we effectively want to do a fee status assessment on you, and then we give you some very detailed feedback on your case, and it's completely free of charge and no obligation. You don't have to work with us. And if you don't want to pursue it, that's absolutely fine. But if you do, then we can start having that conversation. We have a website, we have testimonials, blogs, social media links, loads of stuff about who we are, how long we've been going, that kind of thing. And we also have our inbox. So if you just want to drop us a line, then it's hello@ukstudyoptions.com.
Hey, that was brilliant. Bit scary. As you were talking and giving your presentation, which was excellent, I made a few notes. And the one at the top of my phone in bold writing is, do not let Lucas or Elliot study medicine at Cambridge.
Yeah, I think that's a very good move, Alex.
Wow.
Without Kate's help.
Yeah, I mean, the information that you've given is excellent. And for a father who's got two children, and the people who are watching this live and people who watch this on YouTube and watch it back, you know, for somebody who's got kids to get that level of information, and obviously to use UK study options and yourself as well moving forward. I just have a question, just quickly, before we go into the Q&A, and I'll talk to you a little bit about fees and things. 1,290. I'm assuming that's per child, or is that if you've got two, can you follow the same mold on the second one?
So that's a good question. So it is per child because it covers all 5 universities, and that, you know, that amounts to a lot of work for us if we're fee status assessing for 5 unis. If you've got twins, we'll talk because we know you've had a lifetime of paying double. So, you know, if people have got, you know, twins or something, then we can kind of wiggle on that. But when it comes to a lot of our families, if they use us for the older child, they'll either come back for the second one because they'll just think, you know, we can't risk it. We're coming back to you. Or they might feel confident enough to apply the same knowledge. Yeah, it really depends on how different their children's cases are. So for some families, maybe their older child was born in the UK, but their younger child was born out in Dubai, let's say. So there might be differences between the siblings' cases where they again want our hand holding to get them through. So it's completely up to the family. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the 98% success rate speaks for itself, right? I mean, you know, if you think about playing the lottery, if you've got a 98% chance of winning, or in your case, saving thousands, you're going to play the lottery every week. Yeah. So absolutely.
Yeah. So I should explain the success rate. So the success rate is how many people we support who are getting home fees. So it's very promising. It's very high. And we're proud of that because we do really work our socks off for our families. It doesn't mean that your chances are 98%. Yes. So sorry to disappoint you, but everyone's chance is different. You know, you might have a 50% chance, but that's just how many people are succeeding. But what we do when people fill out this form that the QR code leads to is we will give a really detailed evaluation of your chances. We can't give you a percentage rate, but we will say very clearly, you've got a strong case, or we will say you have a very weak case, and you know we're warning you up front about that. Yeah. So we'll be really frank and give you as much information as you need to know where you stand right now. That's
brilliant. Thank you very much. I think obviously when you were going through the fees, and this is why we approached you, and I know Linda has done a webinar with you before. It's definitely where Holborn as a company can step in and help. So I suppose worst case scenario, £36,000 over a 4-year course, for example, plus living fees is, I suppose, coming up to £25,000 a year. 4-year course, £100,000, best case scenario. You know, also taking into account, as you rightly said, inflation, running 3, 4, 5, 6%, maybe even higher as it is now. You know, that £100,000 does quickly turn to 150, maybe even 200 for children who are below the age of 10. And that's where we as an organisation are able to step in and also help and assess our clients' financial position and ensure that there is funding available, so that when, you know, your children who are 18 years old go to university, it's not coming out of the salary. Putting plans in place early, just like what you said, start planning early. Putting plans in place early to enable parents to afford university fees. In the best case scenario, it's going to be £150,000. In the worst case scenario, 360 grand is what you put on that slide.
Per child.
I nearly fell off my chair. You know, oh my Lord.
And that's right now.
Yeah, and that doesn't include inflation.
So take inflation and then think if you've got 3 kids, you know, £1 million.
Well, you just need to decide which one you love the most, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's where we step in, and we're able to look at the financial situation of our clients and people who are watching this live and online, and assess what is affordable and how you can put plans in place as early as possible so you can afford those fees. I know Linda has had some questions come in via the Q&A. So Linda, I'm going to pass over to you. And please fire some questions at Kate, and I'm sure we've got some good questions there.
Yes, thank you, Alex and Kate. Yes, so we've got a question from Alison, who's on the Zoom today. What evidence will we be asked for?
So in a fee status case to a university, you can submit lots of different types of evidence. Essentially, you're trying to prove the criteria, so that ordinary residence, that regular habitual mode of life, or that temporary absence. So for ordinary residents, you might be looking at evidence such as what property you've got in the UK, what travel to the UK you've done over a number of years. There might be other things like assets and accounts that you have in the UK. And then for things like temporary absence, they might be more interested in your employment contract now in wherever you are outside the UK. And, it might stray into your living circumstances, your visa and things like that. So we actually talk very intensively with our families about what evidence is available, because it's really a case of the more the merrier. You've got to build that case. Evidence is a big part of that case. Universities won't just take your word for it. They have a duty to do a due diligence to make sure they're giving the right funding to people. So they will expect you to prove it with some decent paperwork. Anything you can think of that kind of proves your connection to the UK is particularly valuable evidence.
Great, that's a good answer, Kate, and good question. And just goes to show that you do need your knowledge to be ahead of the game, because if you're trying to scramble at the end to get this ready,
yes,
you're probably not going to make it. Okay, we've got another question from Thomas. Oh, this is an interesting one, actually. Alex, you can perhaps comment on this first. So my older child got home status fees. Is it pretty much a given that my younger daughter will get that as well?
Well, I know for a fact it's not. Not that they're my children personally, because my children are 12 and 8. But a good friend of mine, who you also know, Linda, who works in our industry, is the CEO of a big life company. His first son got home status fees. His second son, who went to university 4 years later, didn't. And the difference in cost was about £30,000 to £35,000 a year difference. So he thought he'd got it. The first one went through absolutely fine, £9,000 a year, whatever it was at the time. And then, when the second one went, there was a big, rude awakening, and it cost an absolute fortune. So, the answer is no, I can guarantee it.
It is very shocking, but unfortunately, it doesn't surprise me at all, because we see this happen all the time. As we were talking about earlier, cases from one student to another are completely different, even within the same family. So it's very common that might happen. The other factor at play there is that universities are getting stricter and stricter by the year. And this is because fee status is impacted by lots of external factors, economic, political, social factors. So the universities are struggling financially a lot at the moment. Tuition fee revenue is a really key source of revenue to them. So, one of their decisions might be to be stricter around their fee status policy in these financially struggling years than they have been 5 years ago, or whenever it was that the older child went to university. So there are lots of reasons why it's not a given that they will both get home fees, fortunately.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Mohammed. How do you prove that you are temporarily absent?
So mentioning earlier about evidence, this is really looking at why you are absent. Why are you absent from the UK? What's the reason? It's expected that is temporary. So technically speaking, you should be going home at some point, although it doesn't necessarily need to be soon. It could be, a few years off. And that is quite difficult to prove. And it's quite subjective on the temporary absence side of things. But some kind of typical ways to prove it are, as I said, looking at your employment contract, looking at your immigration status, looking at how long you've been out of the UK or how long you intend to be out of the UK. So it's giving this information to the universities, any evidence that can back it up. That usually determines somebody's temporary absence case.
Great. Okay, thank you. And one more question before we anybody else wants to throw anything in the chat, they can, or the Q&A. Question from Chris. When is it a good time to contact you about the fee status?
As soon as possible, I would say. I don't know what age your kids are, but the absolute latest you want to leave it is 3 years before university. But we're starting. We work with a lot of the schools in Dubai, in the Gulf. We're really well known by all of the schools there. Usually the secondary schools. But what we have started doing is going to the primary schools and the prep schools to talk more to their parents, because really this is such a long-term planning. You can't come too early. We might be limited on what the fees will be when your child starts university. So there's some information we don't have. But really, the earlier you think about it, the better. And the fee from our side is the same, whether you come 5 years ahead or 5 minutes ahead. So it's actually more benefit to you if you come nice and early. You get us for all of that time at the same rate.